How Not to Marry a Welshman and Other Success Stories. Chapter 1. The Immigration Dance, in which Dinmum bumbles through security, encounters a non-smelly Scotsman, the first in 3 years of living in Asia, and establishes a fortress of peace in a basement café. Dinmum was at immigration. It was not her first time, nor, logistically speaking, would it be her last. By this point in her tenure she had developed a stoic, placid routine around the entire administrative ritual, a performance best described as the immigration dance. Today she was there for the formal hearing and decision regarding her visa, an Ed Plus conversion from the standard tourist visa. It sounded profoundly official on paper. In reality, what it basically meant was waking up, promptly realizing she was not going to make it out of the condo by the mathematically ideal time of 7:30, and getting dressed and around for the day cheerfully, despite that fact. Dressing appropriately was always an excellent thing to do before presenting oneself to Thai immigration, though a staggering number of her fellow expatriates seemed to forget this foundational step entirely. The final phase of preparation required a generous application of perfumed lotion and Kathy Doll Red Rule perfume, the latter a particular favorite and a gift from a past student's family. The application process admittedly made her mouth feel slightly funny and triggered a brief bout of the sniffles, but it was necessary tax to pay. Perfume was the absolute key to survival. Thai immigration invariably reeked. It was an ecosystem permanently filled with dense, slow-moving lines of foreigners clad in casual beachwear, navigating a humid climate who had apparently forgotten that their temporary lodgings possessed the novel 19th century invention known as the shower. Didmum was never entirely certain whether she was witnessing a collective case of sudden onset aquaphobia or merely a shocking lack of cultural awareness. She only knew that even with her own limited olfactory senses, the room was a severe strain on the faculties. One geared up for it. One applied the extra lotion. If nothing else, Dinmum was determined never to be counted as a structural contributor to the problem. Dinmum took a motorcycle taxi to immigration. It was only while she was actively hanging onto the back of this precarious two-wheeled chariot that she realized she had completely forgotten to grab her proof of funds. Uncharacteristically, she decided to shrug it off. She was already halfway there. She held an American passport. She was enrolled at a private university, and in all her administrative dealings over the last few years, absolutely no one had ever asked her to prove her liquidity. For reasons she couldn't entirely fathom, bureaucratic officials invariably assumed she was a visiting British professor. It was a flattering systematic error, considering she did not hold a university degree and was entirely devoid of British citizenship, though her tastes had been definitively homed by the literature and the sensibilities of the Isles since childhood. For the occasion she had assembled an ensemble that leaned heavily into this accidental academic aesthetic. She wore a pair of grey tweed slacks, a light cotton-belled button-up blouse purchased at a train station in Taoyuan, Taiwan, and a short-sleeved black cotton cardigan from America that was over a decade old, yet rarely worn and looking pristine. Her footwear consisted of practical black leather sneakers. Slung over her shoulder was a brown leather satchel, complemented by a black backpack on her back, the latter a strategic calculation so she could run by Lotuses for protein bars and dried bananas once the immigration dance concluded. She also carried an extra bag dedicated entirely to her motorcycle helmet, possessing a healthy logical respect for protecting the noggin on the highways and byways of Bangkok. Finally, her hands clutched a UCC iced latte. Dinmum could easily survive without the concept of breakfast, but without the psychological comfort of knowing a caffeinated beverage was within her arm's reach, her survival parameters became highly uncertain. Topping off the entire ensemble was a pair of brown Hoco headphones, which blended seamlessly into her reddish-brown hair. She was, for all intents and purposes, walking fortress of quiet preparation. Dinmum was, by any conventional metric, an odd blend. She has a delightful paradox, yet difficult to categorize in any known human language. Perhaps an extraterrestrial civilization, possessing the benefit of structural distance from her humanity, would be better equipped to divine her direct parameters. In terms of earthly literary archetypes, and given a recent repeated viewing of Good Omens, she functioned as a complex trifecta of that particular universe. In her aesthetic presentation, her fierce razor-sharp protection of those she cared about, and her capacity to react with absolute unyielding competence if poked or called upon, she was a full-throttle Crowley archetype. Beneath the surface lay that same distinct, reluctant decency, a sovereign heart operating in spite of superficial assumptions. Yet, at her foundational core, she was undeniably an Aziraphale archetype. She possessed an inerrant disdain for conflict, a deep reverence for quiet cafes and old bookshops, and a simple, profound desire for a peaceful coexistence following a lifetime of chaos until her 30s, for which she had never chosen but survived. Her overarching directive was simple: to ensure a better, safer life for those she loved, past, present, and future, leaving them permanently elevated for having crossed her path, if at all possible. She was incandescently brilliant, yet charmingly bumbling, capable of navigating numerous foreign countries and languages entirely on her own terms, refusing to let the reality of being solo diminish her appetite for adventure, but ultimately wishing for nothing more than to be at home with the people and in the spaces she loved the most. She was a Tolkien-esque hobbit-elf mixture of angel and demon, wisdom and sprite. To complicate the geometry further, a third component governed her system. She was logical and exact to a literal degree unparalleled by most of the population. It was a trait that rendered her a modern mid-30s reincarnation of anathema device, minus all the allosexual inclinations by being a gray sexual, and therefore safely spared from ever ending up with, for lack of a better term, a doofus because of prophecies or the throes of passion. Dinmum arrived at her destination and promptly bumbled through security. While she possessed a formidable array of intellectual talents, spatial orientation within a crowded, loud, high-stimulus environment was not among them. Such settings tended to leave her feeling temporarily beached, which was the primary logical reason she avoided noisy environments altogether. Fortunately, the security staff were remarkably kind, operating under the apparent consensus that she was an eccentric, bumbling British professor. They ushered her through with a courteous nod toward her entry receipt and a passport, paying little mind to her complex arrangement of 3 bags and a helmet case. Once inside the main hall, she joined the queue, finding herself positioned directly behind a most unusual specimen, the first non-smelly, non-lecherous Scotsman she had encountered in 3 years of living in Southeast Asia. He was, shockingly enough, fully and appropriately dressed in a clean-colored button-down shirt and proper slacks, devoid of any offensive olfactory emissions or ill intents. His presence ensured that waiting in the queue was a thoroughly painless experience. Furthermore, the encounter offered a rare moment of structural comfort. Standing at nearly 170 centimeters, Dinmum was accustomed to functioning as a towering tree-ish figure among lines of petite Vietnamese or Cambodian travelers doing their own immigration dances. For once, she was not the lone giant in the room. If she was to be tree-ish today, she at least shared the canopy with a fellow tall human. To maintain her internal parameter against the ambient hum of the room, she tapped her brown Hoko headphones and let the music drift in. She was listening to Past Lives by Borns, a track she had originally stumbled across via a 3-season Good Omens tribute video. Fan-made edits and cinematographic mashups ran exceptionally strong in Dinmum's media diet. As she waited, she internally hummed along to what she firmly believed was the lyric, "So save that hug for me." It was, in strict reality, "Save that heart for me," but the logical air mattered very little. The mistranslated lyric felt safer, cozier, and entirely more civilized for a Tuesday morning administrative dance. As the line ticked forward, however, Dinmum noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. She appeared to be actively scaring the Scotsman. It was a familiar phenomenon. Throughout her life, Dinmum had observed that the human population tended to split her identity into 2 equally inaccurate categories. She was either considered an absolute, easily manipulated joy, or a terrifying, unyielding badass. Both suppositions were entirely divorced from structural reality, but the lack of empirical evidence rarely deterred people from assuming them. Children, universally possessing a superior instinct for these matters, viewed Dinmum as a fellow pirate and keeper of sprite. They recognized an inner youth that matched their own, a baseline that frequently resulted in her dogpiling with them or ducking beneath a low table after a runaway toy, completely disregarding both her physical stature and the conventional laws of physics. Adults, conversely, found her utterly impeccable. They perceived her as a counterculture, fiercely independent, and entirely devoid of a desire to conform to the public square's expectations. If an adult was foolish enough to try to poke her, or force her into an arbitrary societal box, they quickly bypassed her gentle, conflict-avoidant Aziraphale archetype exterior and collided head-on with her full-throttle Crowley archetype defense mechanism, wielded with the logic of her anathema device archetypes, logic. The problem with this defense architecture was that it wore Dinmum out to an excessive, exhausting degree. To preserve her emotional currency and maintain her internal fortress of peace, she had long implemented two strict operational rules. First, she remained intentionally mute and deeply introspective whenever adults were present, and second, she rarely, if ever, dated. So, as the pristine Scotsman cast another nervous backward glance at the tall auburn-haired woman sipping a UCC latte in silence, Dinmum simply adjusted her headphones and let the music play on. If her quiet perimeter left him feeling structurally insecure, it was an acceptable tax to pay for a peaceful morning. The queue progressed far faster than Dinmum had mathematically anticipated. The line eventually moved and forked, structurally separating her from the novice Scotsman. In his stead, an elderly British gentleman materialized, kindly guiding Dinmum and three other disoriented expatriates toward the correct counter. There, an official informed her that she was to leave her passport and return in exactly 2 hours. Passport surrendered, Dinmum quickly remoused to the basement level. To her memory, the lower level housed a coffee shop or two. In reality, there were an upwards of 7, and she systematically cased 4 of them before settling on an establishment that possessed adequately padded chairs. There was, in Dinmum's structural estimation, nothing more uncivilized than attempting to endure a 2-hour administrative waiting period on inadequate cushioning. She ordered a black tea and a brownie. In Thailand, a brownie was an empirically safe bet, generally maintaining a flavor profile that resembled its Western counterparts. Thai cakes, by contrast, were an utter culinary free-for-all. Cushioning and safety pastry secured, she settled in for the duration. She queued up the full cast audio recording of Good Omens, because why under the heavens would anyone bother with any other audio version? The mere thought of a lesser recording was a paltry, borderline sacrilegious notion. As the familiar brilliant voices filled the brown headphones, Dinmum multitasked with characteristic efficiency. She began researching hyaluronic acid products on her phone. In her mid-30s, the slight laugh lines around her eyes were the solitary physical indicators that she had surpassed the age of 25. She was determined to minimize them, operating on the firm logical principle that one should always keep the outside world guessing. It was infinitely more interesting when the public square could not pigeonhole you for anything, including your chronological age. With her ears occupied by cosmic comedy and her screen occupied by skincare science, she also managed to complete 2 digital coloring pages. Dimum had never been anything less than industriously productive, even when occupying a padded chair in a subterranean café, waiting out the slow, silent gears of international bureaucracy.